Belgian Defense Minister Theo Francken has warned Russian President Vladimir Putin against launching missile attacks on Brussels. If Putin launches a missile at Brussels, we will wipe Moscow off the map, Minister Francken told the Morgen daily, stressing NATO's collective defense commitment. The Russians have increased their capabilities. Their war economy produces 4 times more ammunition than all of NATO combined. Europe doesn't even have a central command, he said. Francken dismissed the skepticism over the U.S. commitment under President Trump, highlighting Washington's pledge to fully support NATO allies. Furthermore, Francken said Russia's military capabilities must not be underestimated, underlining its significant ammunition production compared with NATO. He also spoke about Russia's military difficulties in Ukraine, because they're fighting against the entire West. The Ukrainians are fighting with our weapons, ammunition, and money. Otherwise, they would have been overwhelmed long ago. Touching upon Moscow's ties with Beijing and the possible challenge this rapprochement can pose to the world, the Belgian minister said, China wants the war in Ukraine to drag on because it weakens the West. It is buying Russian raw materials en masse, supplying weapons, and is perfectly happy for Putin to deploy North Korean troops, he said. Commenting on possible Russian attack on Baltic states, Francken explained that this scenario was less likely as the Baltic countries are member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Soon we'll have 600 F-35s in Europe. The Russians are afraid of them because they can't see them, he added. It should be noted that Belgium has supplied Ukraine with weapons, ammunition, armored vehicles, and air defense equipment. In addition, Belgium has agreed to provide F-16 fighter jets and training for Ukrainian pilots as part of a broader NATO coalition effort.
Ukraine has currently turned Russia's Black Sea Fleet into a kind of budget abyss. The Kremlin is forced to invest heavily in it, but the ship's capabilities are limited to launching missile strikes. Ukrainian Navy spokesman Dmitry Pletenchuk stated this during a telethon. According to him, the Russian Black Sea Fleet has 8 cruise missile carriers. The missile carriers aren't very active right now. Furthermore, not a single unit is currently at sea. Therefore, their functionality is quite limited. Ukraine has turned the Black Sea Fleet into a budget drain for which the Russian Federation is forced to spend large sums of money, the military officer emphasized. He noted that the only active component remains aviation, which is also part of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. This doesn't mean launch vehicles can be written off. Of course, they can go out and use missiles. But as you can see, for various reasons, there's not much activity on their part right now, the spokesman said. As Pletenchuk added, the enemy is always looking for ways to counter the Ukrainian armed forces, which in turn are looking their own way to influence the enemy. Currently, the defense forces primarily use naval drones and missiles to control the Black Sea waters. The aggressor, accordingly, is trying to defend itself against them. Among the threats currently facing us, aviation is the primary one. Besides aviation, we must understand that the enemy will try to somehow adopt our experience in naval warfare using naval drones. We, in turn, must respond to all these challenges, Pletenchuk stated. As a reminder, Ukrainian Navy spokesman Dmitry Pletenchuk previously stated that the most effective countermeasure against Russian Black Sea Fleet ships, whose newest units are currently based in Novorossiysk, is killing the Archer, in other words, destroying them at their base. According to the military man, the occupiers are primarily using submarines for shelling, despite their limited service life and their more complex maintenance than surface ships. He noted that at some point, the Black Sea occupiers will face the consequences of this constant exploitation. But for now, the problem exists, and it can be solved in 2 ways. The first is to saturate the Ukrainian skies with our air defenses, and the second, as our partners say, is to kill an Archer, to destroy these units directly at their base. The Russians are well aware that such a danger exists. They periodically leave the naval harbor for training purposes and otherwise. Nevertheless, the so-called Black Sea Fleet still has 8 cruise missile carriers. The speaker admitted, as he added, although the effectiveness of the calibers is not as high as at the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, they can periodically harass people.
Ukraine estimates that recent strikes on Russian fuel infrastructure have eliminated roughly 22 to 27% of Moscow's refined fuel production, President Volodymyr Zelensky told reporters on October 28. That shortfall, he said, produced long lines at gas stations and forced Russian authorities to shift fuel flows between remaining refineries. Zelensky said Kiev's campaign has degraded Russian refining capacity by more than 20%, and explained that as Russia repaired some facilities and redirected supplies, other plants increased output to cover gaps. Our task is clear: continue to target the refineries that have ramped up, especially diesel production, he said, citing his review of battlefield analytics. The president outlined a simple formula for sustaining pressure: Ukraine's long-range weapon manufacturers must keep producing, Kyiv must secure steady financing for those purchases, and the country must persistently work to weaken the Russians economically. He framed refinery-produced revenue as a primary source of funding for Moscow's war effort. Their money for the war comes from refining, Zelensky said. Zelensky added that the work is continuous, striking targets, tracking where fuel flows are redirected, and adapting Ukraine's targeting accordingly, and stressed that keeping diesel supplies constrained is a tactical priority given its importance for logistics and frontline mobility. Zelensky added that Ukraine is using long-range weapons of its own production, alongside smaller numbers of British Storm Shadow and French Scalp cruise missiles. He emphasized that 90 to 95% of strikes deep inside Russia are now carried out using Ukrainian-made systems, adding that Kyiv will continue developing its arsenal and securing funding to further weaken Russia's economic base. This is their money for the war, from oil refining. That's why we're working on it, he said. The Institute for the Study of War earlier reported that after Ukraine's successful attacks on Russian oil refineries, fuel prices in Russia surged sharply, already hitting more than 70% of Russians. Since August, Ukraine has intensified drone attacks on Russia's oil and gas infrastructure, striking refineries and pipelines across the country. Earlier, Russia sent its first shipment of crude oil to Georgia for refining, marking an unexpected deepening of energy ties between the two countries despite years of political tension. The deal comes amid a fuel processing crisis inside Russia, where repeated Ukrainian drone strikes have forced Moscow to reroute oil supplies and seek new refining options abroad.